Hey, kia ora koutou whānau. Welcome back to another edition of Big Hero News. Stepping in for the ignominious Chewy. The Chewy's not here. Bomber is.
Guest beard.
Guest beard. And apparently I'm learning new terms every single day thanks to my Twitter friends. Apparently we have neck beards. I'm not quite sure what that is, but apparently if you're a neck beard, that's supposed to be a bad thing. So, how are you, man?
Good. Yourself?
Yeah, busy as, eh? Right, really busy. Lots going on. Just having a blast. Just life's trucking along at the moment. Sort of in shock somewhat for what's happening politically. Just like it's just feeling not real. You know what I mean?
It's like every day you wake up and there's a new crazy thing that they're doing. They've just attacked some other vulnerable group in society and are beating the bejesus out of them for no clear reason other than they're desperately trying to find 2.9 billion in tax breaks for the richest landlords. And it's just so obscene. And we've all got to pretend like it's normal now. Like, who's the poor unfortunate buggers that decided to beat up on today? You know?
See, these are my notes I take for each show. See these notes? There's pages and pages of notes that I write down for each show. And last night during the show, while we were talking, I wrote down what problem are you trying to solve? And Chewy was very good at constantly asking that question before the election and saying the problem that National's trying to solve is they're not government, and that's it. And it feels like now every single policy they're doing, the problem they're trying to solve is the $2.9 to $5.8 billion gap. So everything, you say, what problem are you trying to solve with that? It's not like anything to do, like, I literally laughed out loud watching the news tonight. I'll show you in a second, but it was like I laughed out loud because I went, they're trying to get revenue. They're trying to get revenue for their $2.9 to $5.8 billion hole. So that's the problem they're trying to solve. So look, before we do all this, Bomber, because gosh, we're already into it, man, let's just say a huge thanks to our patrons. I love you guys to bits. Thanks for being on board. You help us to do what we do. I want to say a special thanks to a couple of new patrons that have come up in the last 24 hours. That is, I've got to move this. Kathy Hunt and Tom Doran. Welcome to the whānau. So good to have you on board, and thanks to all of our regular patrons. We'll be doing a meetup probably, I've got to work it out because I think next weekend is Easter and then I'm away the following weekend. So maybe the weekend after that we'll do an online meetup. We're just thinking, Marty, we're getting to the kind of response from all the kind of cities in particular. We're just about up for, I think, a tour around the country. Meetups in person would be fun. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. I'll come along to the Auckland one.
Well, we've done it in Dunedin once and it kind of worked. And so we're thinking let's do this. We're going to aim for 10,000 subs by June 30th. And we're going to aim to do a meetup in the major centres by the end of 2024. There you go. There's a couple of things we'll put out there.
Done.
This is really, I didn't know when I was going to use this tonight, so it's not really a full story, but it's about the things that National's going to do with vaping, right? I'll just do it right now because we're talking about what problem are you trying to solve? I watched this, right? This is only about 10 seconds. This is what they're going to start to do to try and stop people from vaping. Here we go.
The government today announcing a crackdown banning the sale of disposable vapes and increasing fines for retailers caught selling to under 18s from $10,000 to $100,000.
Yeah, exactly. That your response of laughing into your hand. When you're by yourself at home watching like stand-up comedy, you don't laugh as much as when you're in a group because there is a culture of laughing in a group. I literally laughed out loud when I saw this because they're going to be charging dairy owners $100,000 if they sell a vape to a 15 or 16-year-old. And remember, the Dairy Owners Association, huge supporters of National, all the ram raid stuff that they were always on talking about bad Labour, good National. And I saw this and I literally laughed out loud. I'm not just saying that like you say, but I laughed out loud when I saw that on the news because the problem they're trying to solve with the $100,000 fine is the gap they have in revenue. It's everywhere.
Yeah, I mean that's an extraordinary write-up, and you're absolutely right. It sounds very much like, oh my God, we need $500,000 from somewhere. Everything look, I mean, on the wider issue of the vapes, I think that has been an under-regulated area for our young people and for
Agreed.
our fellow Kiwis. I think vaping is a great way for people who are heavy tobacco smokers to get onto something that's going to be less harmful for them, and I think we want that. But the way it's become a recreational tool, I just think is crazy.
This is the thing, right? And I love watching. I tend to post and ghost on Twitter. I don't often interact, but sometimes I do occasionally because it's fun. But I love watching when you say something publicly or on Twitter or whatever, and then people make an assumption based on what you've said. So, for example, when I put that out there, the ideas around that out there, everyone started to say, so I was pro teenagers vaping. It's like, no, what I'm showing you is the hypocrisy of this government. Remember, they released the smoke-free 2025 obligations because they didn't want a black market. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Yet, they're going to ban certain vapes. What if they go to the black market, Mr. Luxon? It's the same argument. So be really aware. Like banning cell phones in school, I don't care about that. I think it could be quite good. Cell phones are a pain in the ass with teenagers. I've got them. I know. However, when you're a government that fights against the nanny state and you talk about all the control Labor has, all these things, and you do something that's incredibly nanny state, you're going to get called out for it. I'm not about teenagers vaping, but I am about these guys who are obviously looking to find money for their hole, their big gaping holes, and who are saying we're okay with smoking. They should have the right to smoke, and we don't want a black market, but they're banning vapes, which you could use exactly the same argument to them. So I'm about calling out the hypocrisy above and beyond what the actual legislation is.
And are those? And I mean, those penalties seem very steep. They seem steeper than the penalties for actual tobacco.
Yeah, probably. I'm not sure the numbers. Yeah. So look, I mean, I think we talked about last night, Marty, that we're going to keep coming back to that. What problem are you trying to solve? What problem are you trying to solve? What problem are you trying to solve? And it just appears to me more and more is about the problem we're trying to solve is we've made promises that we can't fulfill financially, so we need more money. Later tonight, we're going to talk about the IMF and what they had to say about New Zealand, especially when it comes down to borrowing for tax cuts and the tax cuts being inflationary. But look, I'll start with this one first of all, Bomber, because this one kind of caught me off guard. But again, what is, we talk about Lux, what's his name? Lex Luthor. So it's Lux Luthor. We talk about Lux Luthor, our Prime Minister, who seems to be, and his allies, who seem to be reaching that superhero villain status. And we had another one of those stories coming out today, cuts to disability services. Nicola Willis told Stuff that news came as a surprise and she had not been told how dire the situation was at Whaikaha, the Ministry for Disabled Communities, before news broke on Tuesday. She said there was a briefing earlier this year warning Whaikaha was stressed, but she said that scale of the situation was not clear, the scale. It was in context of a broader briefing listing agencies that had asked for early budget decisions and the rationale for it. On balance, the decision we got to was that we would just make decisions as part of the normal budgetary process. Then on Monday, Whaikaha surprised Willis and thousands of families with disabilities, announcing it would remove funding for a range of services, including respite care. The news this week was a surprise to me. I can also confirm I had a briefing today with the minister at Whaikaha to understand their funding situation and understand what is required from the government. We've got a little bit of video here. I'm not going to play a lot of it because it's just a stand up with the disability minister coming out. And I'll play you a couple of minutes to see what she had to say today.
You've got families being told they can no longer afford wheelchairs and respite care.
No, it's not frontline cuts at all. There have been no cuts brought in for the funding. In fact, there's been 10% more put into the fund for equipment. So it is not cuts. It is a policy situation that was...
It's a little bit like there'll be no new taxes, Bomber, but there's all these fees popping up around the place and levies. No taxes, but new levies on things like registrations for cars, that kind of thing.
Set up by the previous government that has seen more than double the spend occurring in the flexible individualised funding. That's put pressure on obviously the amount of money that was there to be able to be used, and so now we have to look at how we prioritise that. And the first instance must be prioritising that use for disabled people.
Why did you not consult with any of the disabled community before doing this? They were absolutely blindsided yesterday and they're really upset with you.
Yeah, look, I understand that some who have been able to access that funding, that have been using the funding, carers that have been using the funding for their personal care, are upset about losing that. I will talk to Waikaha about how announcements are made in the future. They do have a...
So very clearly, it's not a mistake that they've done it. They'll just want to make sure that Whakaha is informed when they do it again about the communication.
A stakeholder group that they discuss things with, but this fund has blown out and they have to manage it within the fund that's there.
So that goes back just directly the whole thing to 6.5% cuts, 6.5% cuts. The problem is, though, there was an email bomber. I don't know if you've seen this, that came out and it paints a slightly different picture. There was a leaked email accidentally sent to the wrong recipient, and it said due to financial cost and pressures on government departments, the ministry would now actively enforce a set budget cap on the provision of equipment, wheelchairs, and modification services. I wanted to notify you in advance that this is likely to result in some reduction in orders over the next few months, the email said. Today, the Disability Issues Minister said the enforcement budget caps and reductions in orders were not cuts. Penny Simmonds said that, in fact, 10% more funding was being put into the fund and equipment, so contrary to this email. And finally, talking about where the greatest need funding would occur. That's what she said. And I highlighted that one sentence, Bomber, because we're hearing this a lot. We're hearing, trust us, where the greatest funding is needed, we will put it. We're hearing it in the housing situation when they're talking about the new rules around emergency housing, and they say there will always be emergency houses for those in need. And then they're also saying, but if you contribute to the reason for having your emergency housing, you may not be eligible, but there'll always be one for those who really need it. But we've got no new rules that might eliminate you, but there'll always be it. And I kind of feel the same about this. The greatest need funding will occur, where it will go to. And this is like, they're saying it, but will they do it?
It's all part of their social investment model, which is a means of eroding universal provision of welfare. The argument is we'll put the funds in the areas who cost us the most long term, the worst of the worst, because these ones cost the state ongoing, and we'll put extra resources there at the cost of a universal provision of those services, because the universal provision of those services gets societal buy-in from the wider community. Something like free public transport gets massive buy-in from everyone who uses it. So you erode the solidarity of the universalism, you make it just the worst case scenario, and you say you fund those things. But that misses so many others who are needing help, and it's a way of almost privatizing welfare. So I'm not a believer in that system. And of course, if it's only going after the worst case ones, and it's a smaller budget required for that, well, that's less money going to the state, and that's the rights project, to constantly strangle off revenue going to the state so it doesn't have the money to redistribute in the first place. So this is the game that they're playing at the moment.
So we played something last night from John Stewart, Marty, and talking about the right trying to strangle off funding. The thing that he put out there, which I think we can align to us, is this is what the right does. When they're not in government, they say government's broken. Then they get into government and everything they do breaks government. And then they can point at it and go, see, the government's broken because they broke it. And then they go, we have the answer. It's PPPs, it's asset sales, it's privatisation. So when you mention sort of the funding and what they're doing, it's this idea that they say it's broken, they then break it, they then point to it and say, we told you it was broken.
No.
It's the plan. It's Lex Luthor. It's evil.
No. Well, and that's their constant drive. And I think because so much of their policy were lobbyist talking points for the election, and they're now desperately trying to flesh that out into actual policy without making it look as venal as it is.
Yeah.
And that's going to be tough for them because it's really, really self-interested. The deregulation program they're going to run for their donors will be as self-interested as that sounds.
The other thing that is becoming more and more evident, do you know if a sort of neoliberal government came along and they said we're gonna sort out all of the public money issues, and they started at the top, you know, they went after white collar crime, they went after all that kind of stuff, and they worked their way down to emergency housing, you'd go, I mean, I don't like it, the vulnerable, but at least they're consistent in their messaging. But what they're doing is they're not just starting at the bottom, they're going to the bottom, and then they're getting the most vulnerable of those ones down the bottom, and they're starting with them. Because, you know, Bomber, the most vulnerable of the most vulnerable have had it too good for too long, and we certainly need to sort those guys out, don't we?
Those state tenants, yeah. Look, here's my thoughts. Neighbours at war don't just happen amongst state tenants, eh? Mm-hmm. Like New Zealanders and everywhere, right? People sometimes, bless them, they're just assholes, and people don't like living together, right? And they started, and that kind of friction is actually way wider than state tenants. Now, for those state tenants who are doing those sorts of antisocial behaviour things, look, how awful must that be for those who are forced to live around them? And every effort must be made to make sure people feel safe in their state homes, right? Yeah. So everybody's deserving of that. But my fear when we start throwing people out onto the streets is that these problems start to metastasize into social ill way worse than neighbours in dispute. Because what the government is suggesting is that these people just go move in with whānau if they get kicked out. Now, I don't know about you, but I know a lot of families who are just holding on by their fingernails, and if they suddenly had an incredibly unruly family have to move in, that would be enough to topple it over. I think that we need to keep people in state houses, and we've got to try and help and do a lot more investment into those state houses. Throwing people out onto the street, and remember, look at the stats, 60% of those with arrears have children, and 42% of those who've had complaints have children. You throw these people onto the street, you're throwing hundreds or thousands maybe of children onto the street as well. And that's not a social policy, that's a revenge fantasy.
Yeah, completely, totally, utterly. Let's just say thanks, because I've got a question for you here, Marty, to some of the people who have come on the Super Chat. Look, someone getting themselves, I was going to say a free advert, but no, fair enough. Paid for a Super Chat, get an advert. Mr. Alex, just letting your listeners know that Harm Reduction Coalition Aotearoa is open to memberships. $2 for unwaged, unemployed, $10 for waged and employed. Yes. Allows access to meetings, and the membership form is on the BHN Discord. Knock yourself out. Go for it. And thank you for the Super Chat. And here's one for you from Frosty. And because we were just talking about this, maybe you can share some news to people. Quick! Before anything starts, sorry, Frosty, a bit late for that. Tēnā koe, Pat and Martin. Rest in peace, Chewy. He's not, I mean, well, yeah, okay. I saw Chewy today. He's doing fine. He's tired from writing all these reviews for the Dunedin Fringe Festival. Is the Working Group podcast coming back? Question mark, exclamation, exclamation, question mark, exclamation, exclamation.
I was told not to say anything tonight.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, it's making a stealth return next week.
Okay. Who are you in trouble with now for not saying anything?
We just want to get the bloody thing on air before we get shot.
Very good. Hey, now we're going to move into probably the biggest story of the day, or kind of the week, actually. It's Winston Peters and his comments from his State of the Nation speech. Let's set up with a couple of things before we go into today's conversation, because Winston Peters is now saying, I wasn't comparing Nazis to the Labour government. There's there's a little bit of evidence that maybe counters that, and that's this fellow called Mr. Winston Peters, when he was asked that exact question, and he said that's what he was talking about. Let's just have a listen before we get into stuff.
I've seen that sort of philosophy before. I saw it in Nazi Germany. We all did.
You compared Labour's approach to co-governance to Nazi Germany. Is that appropriate?
Yes, it is.
So that's called a mic drop. He was asked the question, you compared Labour's approach to co-governance to Nazi Germany. Is that appropriate? He said, yes, it was. So he was, right? So I mean, we can get into all sorts of semantic word games. You were either lying there or you're lying now. We know. Yes, it was. The other thing we want to sort out, we did this last night, Marty, and I'll just say it, this is from my Twitter feed. And I want to put this out really clearly. I'll say this again, even though we said it last night. This is what he said in his speech. I've seen that sort of philosophy before. I saw it, apparently he was there, in Nazi Germany. We all did. We've seen it elsewhere around the world in the horrors of history. So the question is, what is the horror of history he is citing that was seen in Nazi Germany? Right? What is it? Because he's talking about these horrors of histories that have been around. He invokes Nazi Germany. What's that name? There's a singular.
It's not aggressive parking, is it? No.
Yeah, there's a singular word for the particular horror of history that he cited when he talked about they've happened all over the time like they did in Nazi Germany. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that's called the Holocaust. So we can stop the bullshit, right? Completely stop the bullshit about did he, didn't he? Yes, we know that his minions are out there trying to square that circle, but he said it was about Labour, and he cited a historical horror as one of the ones that happened in Nazi Germany. Right, that conversation's over. Let me say something else though. I couldn't give a fuck about Chumbawamba. I don't know about you, Marty, but I could not give a fuck about that story. I didn't care about the M&M story in the National. It was a quirky little thing on the side. I couldn't give a fuck about that story, and I think it's quite important that we don't get too distracted by thinking about this band. Who cares, right? This is too serious and too dangerous a moment to be focused on a band out of Liverpool who, albeit, have had one or two hits. You know, so even though we're going to play some stuff that references that actual story, I don't give a shit about. What are your thoughts before we get into it, Marty?
It's been a really interesting week. You know what? Let's give Winston.
Yep.
The absolute benefit of the doubt, and say he was just talking about the Maori Party, and he was talking about. Let's ignore all evidence. Let's ignore all of the evidence that clearly states that's not the case. But let's just do that for 30 seconds and agree with him that he was talking about the Maori Party. And the specific he was talking about the Maori Party was a comment, a throwaway, jokey jibe about Maori DNA being superior. Something about that. And when he was challenged on it, Rawiri sort of played up to the camera, right? Let's just say he was referencing that.
Sure.
Does anyone honestly think a tongue-in-cheek comment like that by the Maori Party amounts to Nazism? That's equivalent to, because this is the problem with Winston's argument. Even if we take him at his word, that that's what he was talking about, the Maori Party and that comment that they made about their DNA being superior. A one sentence, I think, mention is what they had on there. Even if we took him at his word, the hyperbole he is involving and invoking by comparing it to bloody Nazi Germany is so extreme and off the ramp. Yeah. It doesn't matter, you know. This is really dangerous language from the Deputy Prime Minister of the country. He came off unhinged. This is embarrassing to all of us, and it speaks to a dynamic whereby he is constantly competing with David Seymour to capture the reactionary vote, and it's creating this unique dynamic where the Prime Minister looks incredibly weak.
Yeah.
I mean, he came out and said, "Oh, Luxon's getting flustered and upset because of the media." Oh my God, he said it directly to his face. This is a government that is not going to last 1 week after Winston steps down as Deputy Prime Minister. It's going to a snap election.
Yeah, and we'll have a look at some of the comments you made today. And like I said, I don't really care about the Chumbawamba conversation, but what it has done is it's given us an opportunity to see how Winston responds to it. And I think that's almost as scary as anything. The language he's using now, what he's saying of the media, how he's pushing back like that. And let me make this clear to you. His base will love
this. They absolutely are
lapping it up.
Yeah.
This is straight from Trump's playbook.
Yeah,
the paid for and bought media, the leftist. He started using the term lefty shill at one stage. If you haven't seen it, he actually accuses Anna Burns-Francis of being racist in this conversation.
I saw that train wreck of an interview this morning. It was terrible.
Well, let's have a look at a couple of bits because we like we're sadists here. We like a bit of pain. Let's have a look. There's only a few clips I'm going to play you. This is actually a response to Chumbawamba, which I don't care about that story, but it's particularly interesting to me to hear how, as you say, Martin, our Deputy Prime Minister is speaking to our public broadcasters.
But some lefty shill who doesn't like some honesty about racism and how negatively bad it is for our country decided to call them, and like you, misinform the poor band that have been disbanded all those years ago and try and make something of it. You're not going to succeed, so don't waste my time or your viewers' time.
Right, we'll play a few of these. We've got a couple of short clips to go through. There's another one, and this is where he lies about what he said. No, actually, Anna Burns-Francis reads him the clip we've just watched about what he said, and just a straight up lie. The thing, I put a thing on Twitter today, and I kind of said, look, if you're not going to take the evidence and be honest about it, then you are actually the shill for your side of the political conversation. It's actually okay. This is what I don't understand, Marty. Maybe I'm too balanced, believe it or not. It's actually okay to go, hey, we took the L on this one. Actually, this wasn't okay. And then tomorrow fight whatever you think the good fight is again. But if you just won't do that, if you just won't take the L, it's this thing about ideology versus intelligent debate. An ideologue thinks they're always right. And we all know as human beings, sometimes we're wrong. So if an ideologue goes, I'm always right, that's actually impossible. There are some times when you're going to be wrong. And that's the difference between ideology and intelligent debate. And people who just will not and willfully don't see the evidence in front of them from his own mouth where he said, I was talking about Labour and their comparison, then you're an ideologue, and I don't want to say you're eliminated from the conversation, but I don't see any time engaging with them, Marty.
Well, this is the problem with the big lie, isn't it? Trump's big lie is the election was stolen from me.
Yeah.
Winston's big lie is the entire media were bribed. Now, even if we unpack it, even if you are to agree that one of the funding notes in the New Zealand On Air parameters for the journalism fund required you not to be, corrosive towards the treaty, even if you were accepting of that note that was put in the funding rounds, you would also then have to acknowledge that after there was some criticism towards New Zealand On Air for those brackets in the funding notes, that there was a statement of intent that came back from New Zealand On Air that said this didn't mean any editorial control over the content. So New Zealand On Air responded after those funding parameters came out, made it clear it didn't have anything to do with the editorial content. Yeah. And yet Winston is picking that up. That's what he's picking up. And he's screaming the entire media were bribed. When you have people who are so far down the rabbit hole on media fed by hate algorithms, this sort of conspiracy theory stuff that he's throwing up, the entire media were bribed, that is like raw meat to these people, and he's just feeding this into his conspiracy swamp kingdom now. This is where he's getting his 8%. And you're right, it is creating more people to come to him because of the polarization of politics. But what it is doing is it's scaring the bejesus out of soft national voters not vote for this culture war stuff at all. They voted national because they were hoping their house price would go up by 10%. They didn't vote national for this. And that's where you'll start to see the collapse and the turn as the soft national vote just decamps and go, this is ugly, we're out. New Zealand First will do well, but Luxon is ultimately the person who gets hurt from this craziness.
Absolutely. So the second part of the clip we're going to play now is where he did actually lie about what he'd said. Amber Burns-Francis pulls him up on it. And this is really, I mean, honestly, the train wreck of this 8 minutes, we could have watched it all. I couldn't have. So I'm playing as little as possible, trust me. But I think it's important for us to see him in all his, whatever the opposite of glory is.
Totally.
All his glory whole. Maybe that's what the opposite is. I'm not entirely sure. Let's have a look.
Tell me, what was the sin that I committed here? But to say that somebody who thinks that their DNA is more superior, like Waititi said from the Maori Party, never called up by you, and all the other people who've been talking about things like the Holocaust and genocide, all the words from other politicians, never called up by you, so that somehow that person is excused from saying the offensive thing that they said. And I'm calling out.
Your comments weren't about Rawiri Waititi, were they, though? They weren't. You were asked what your comments were about. You said quite clearly, you were asked quite clearly if there was a comparison to Labor's approach.
Please don't argue. You've had your 24 hours of life.
I mean, please don't argue. Who? I mean, he's Deputy Prime Minister, but still, who the fuck do you think you are? Please don't argue. He's a reporter, a journalist asking you questions.
Now here comes the truth.
Would you like me to play the clip, Mr. Peters?
In my speech, I referred. I don't have to play this clip. I've got the speech in front of me. I know what I said.
Ironically, of which the comment that was made was not a part of. It was an ad-lib. So I wouldn't actually think that the speech in front of him would actually even reference what it was, because it wasn't a part of the speech.
I know.
It was ad-lib. So he probably wouldn't be able to find it in the speech in front of him.
I referred to Waititi talking about Maori DNA being superior to everybody else's. And that slippery slope of awful racism is what this country's been living through.
Mr. Peters, you were asked, you compare Labor's approach to co-governance to Nazi Germany. Is that appropriate? And you said, yes, it is. Now, I'm phrasing that, I'm reading that out, but we have the clip if you would like us to play it.
Look, I'm sure you've got some intelligence. The logic of what you just said is that I didn't give it in my speech. I was asked it by the media trying to fit me up. You said...
Well, you answered it.
Mr. Peter, you were asked, but you said I said it in my speech. You get the point here? Now, look, all I want from the...
No, we don't get the point, Mr. Peters.
I watched this live this morning, and just my mouth was open the whole time as he's running, just going, this is ridiculous.
We do not get the point.
New Zealand media, paid for by the taxpayer, is some unbiased neutrality and honesty.
We are all paid by the taxpayer, Mr. Peters, you and I both.
The thing to be aware of as well, I'm 99% sure, I will double check this, but the news shows like Breakfast and 6pm aren't actually paid by the taxpayer dollars. They have to be self-funding. 6pm News gets no engine funding.
You're right. They are self-funded. I mean, it's a state asset, but sure.
but they don't get any public money per se to do that show.
That's right.
So just to make that clear for him. So he lies about what he said. And then I heard a comment from who was it? Bryce Edwards, kind of saying that this was been a good week for Winston because he's everywhere. And I thought, interesting. Anna Burns-Francis asks him a little bit about not being happy with the headlines. It's been a shocker of a week. You mustn't be happy with these headlines. And let's have a look what he said about that.
Look, with the greatest respect, the band did nothing of the sort. Some lefty shill like you got in contact with them, lied to them about what my message has been for 40-long years of equality, regardless of race or gender or economic background, misinformed them, and then thought you could get away with it. Bad news for you and bad news for them is you're not going to win. Get over it.
I think the band can probably make up their own mind. I'm sure they're all free and independent thinkers there. They have put out this statement themselves.
Excuse me? Did they call me? Did the person call me from the BBC?
We always talk about this as well. Listen to what he's saying and remember it, because he's suggesting that for someone to pass comment, they need to make a connection with him. If he passes comment on anybody else in the next year or two that he hasn't personally made contact with, we need to bring this clip back up and go, he is undermining the story by saying, well, they never spoke to me. Well, Mr. Peters, I hope for the next 18 months or whatever it is that you're Deputy Prime Minister, if you comment on anyone on any person, on any media, you have made personal connection with them, or else hypocrisy, thy name is Peters. Anything before we keep going, Marty?
Yeah. This is a spectacle. He's competing with David Seymour. Next week, David's going to come out and do something even more outrageous. Then Luxon will try and come out and regain the narrative. Then Winston will come out, and this is the dynamic we're going to just see going around and around and around. It's a maelstrom.
Yeah. All right, let's keep going on this clip about not being happy with the headlines. And then we've got one more little clip after this, is where he actually calls Anna Burns-Francis a racist.
You got in contact with? No. Just, here we go again. Unlike Phil Collins' great song, they're not telling both sides of the story.
Do I take it off those comments then that you are unhappy with the headlines that you're getting this week and that it is becoming a distraction?
No, excuse me, I'm not. Look at the social media. You're losing 95 to 5%.
Okay, Boomer, look at the social media. Look at it, the social media.
You're getting smashed there with your bias, and everybody's finding this sort of narrative from you out. Now, it's sad to say, probably you're an innocent person, but your ownership and your production team need to get over their silly selves. Nobody likes it anymore.
Mr. Peters, you are the Foreign Minister of this country and the Deputy Prime Minister. Is this the sort of rhetoric that we should expect from our leaders representing us on the world stage?
Honesty, transparency and openness, yes, they do. And that's why I'm sure people do, not being immodest here, seriously respect the new face of New Zealand foreign affairs.
Honesty and transparency. Would you mind telling us what Christopher Luxon said to you at your meeting on Monday?
Yes, he said to me, I was told this, and this, and I said to him, by who? Did you hear my speech? No. And then about then I realised, like so many New Zealanders, all the way to the top, he's been misinformed by you media people who think that your shill lefty biased message is going to triumph.
Mr. Peters, you cannot be accusing the Prime Minister of this country of being influenced so wholly by the media and being unable to find out your comments in your speech himself, are you?
I just said that, and that's the truth. I had the conversation with him. You didn't. But unlike that doesn't bother you people. Facts and truth don't matter to you. Just the manipulation of bias. No wonder the media is in such a big trouble in our country, sad to say. But
Would you repeat?
Some of you deserve better.
Yeah, so that was the end part of that clip as well. I mean, it says to me this one of a few things here. If he's telling the truth, then this is the worst Prime Minister and the most feckless leader there's ever been that gets influenced by the media to make decisions, right? I don't believe he's telling the truth. I believe he's lying. So either the media is the most powerful monolith in the country that is actually driving Christopher Luxon to make decisions, right? Or it's not, and Winston Peters is lying. And I believe the latter is more likely, Marty.
I think that he is trying to sell his tone. I think that there is a large chunk of New Zealand who feel very put out by cosmopolitan New Zealand, who feel very angry with educated New Zealand, who feel very alienated by a certain part of New Zealand. And that tone of resentment is what Winston's selling. He's selling political resentment. And he feels that now is the time to keep pushing that, no matter what the point is. I mean, there's no way you could look at those interviews objectively standing back and think this was good for Winston. But he's not talking to the yous and me's. No. He's talking to a big chunk of alienated New Zealand who are feeling more resentful by the minute. Now, he knows, now he's inside the government, that the economic indicators coming up are in real free fall, that we have got a real hard and heavy rain is going to fall. And I think that he is getting those anxieties up front in front of a very reactionary base, so we're going to feel economically fragile and frightened in the coming months. And he's putting his bait out first before David Seymour does.
We had Justine Sachs on last night from Dainu, the group, the Jewish group objecting to occupation. And she wondered during the conversation if Mr. Seymour did this on purpose to one-up Seymour, who last compared it to South Africa. And so I can't compare it to South Africa. What's the next thing I can compare it to? Well, Nazi Germany would be the one-up of it. That I'll compare it to them, and so they're actually competing for that position you're talking about.
I think she's absolutely on the money there. It is a constant tug of rope war for news oxygen, and Winston's pulling it this way. You know, I mean, how many State of the Nations do we need from these guys, right? Yeah. And they're all trying to one-up each other, and they're constantly playing for dominance, which is why there was every possibility if we hit 18 months and New Zealand first is 8% and ACT is 6%.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't he pull the trigger? Why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't he? He is that wily, right? And he's about surviving.
And I know everybody's missing Chewy because he is the fan favourite. We do know that. I'm not at all upset about that, by the way, Marty. But I saw Chewy today, and he was like, "I'm so annoyed that I'm not there the week that you guys are talking about Winston." And he offered a little pearl, which I thought was an interesting thought as well. He goes, "What else could be going on behind the scenes when we're all looking at the Winston, Nazi conversation? I feel like they're not smart enough to be that calculating, but is this a little bit squirrel, look away, focus on the shiny thing when there's other things going on in the background? If this is what we're seeing, imagine what we're not seeing."
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There is a real war going on because they all know now just how bad the books are. They know the economy's in real free fall. Some of these indicators coming up, bubbling away in the background, suggest there has been an enormous drop-off of trade with China. It's really going to impact us. And they've got no plans other than privatization. I think there's a part of it is naked fear, and they're all just trying to get a handle of and hold of the narrative long enough to try and get some direction going. But because they're all pulling against each other, and they're all adverse, all hate each other as well, for God's sakes, they're all going at it all the time.
Let's have a look at this last part. The last part of this conversation is where he actually does accuse Anna Burns-Francis of being racist. It slides through. It's like a quick comment, but it's absolutely what he says. Something like your racist thoughts or your racist beliefs. So he's talking to a TVNZ journalist, which is part of the public, the public broadcasting in New Zealand, as close as we've got to it. And he accuses her of being racist.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure if we clarified if you would repeat the use of the phrase comparing New Zealand's previous governments to Nazi Germany, but will you at least stop using the song, or are you going to use Chumbawamba's song again?
I'm not backing down to your shill lefty bias.
It was just a question.
With the crushing pinko view that you've got, that you can get away with this racism. I despise racism.
No, it's a question asking if you would repeat the phrase that you have already chosen to use. Well, you used the phrase, would you use it again?
It's be obvious to you, even though you have got it clouded out by your own noise and the noise of your colleagues, that I'm not going to back down. Yes, I will repeat it because it's the truth. This sort of superior belief that because I've got my DNA superior to you is repugnant.
I mean, to be honest with you, I've been thinking about this the last couple of days. We've contacted Brooke Van Velden. We've contacted David Seymour. They won't talk to us. And I just had this thought today. If I was in a conversation with Winston Peters on this platform and he spoke like that, I'd be like, fuck you. What the fuck are you talking about, you old cunt? Just get off your high horse. It's like, it feels like that's the correct response. Like I don't kind of speak like that in real life very much, but that feels like that's the correct way. The way he just spoke to her, talking about your racist views, and I'd be like, it kind of feels like stop talking to him. Like honestly, you have a privilege to be on that show doing that thing. Cut him off. Like just cut him off.
This goes back to my earlier point just about how unhinged he has become in the last 72 hours since this speech. Yeah. And it's on purpose. He is throwing out such abusive terms. I mean, pinko. We haven't heard pinko since the 80s, for God's sakes, right? Yeah. And here he is, it's just pinko. Off he goes. I think that, I think we're in trouble economically. I think each of the political sides are going to be firing up their base because all they've got are culture war, revenge fantasies, and anger and resentment to sell. I don't think they've got a hell of a lot they're going to be able to do that's going to make anyone feel economically secure.
Yeah.
So they're going to have to trade on this shit. And Winston's smart enough to know that. And he's just going to, every week, there'll be him doing this. And then next week it'll be, David Seymour wanting AK-47s and creches. It'll just be, and you're just going, you can. The thing is, each week we turn from one thing and go, oh my God, that's such a bad and terrible and counterproductive and stupid idea. And then the next week is another one. And oh my God, this is even worse than that one. And then you go back to the, and they just keep rolling it out. And this is why, and for everyone who's watching and paying attention and just feeling hurt and pain in their soul and in their gut, this feeling right here that you're feeling, this horrible, horrible sense of horror, this is the feeling you got to hold on to, because this is why it's important to vote. This is why it's important to get every single one of your friends out to the ballot box. This is why you've got to get all of the whānau and all of the friends and pull in as many people, because this feeling right now that you're feeling at all of this terrible stuff that's happening, this is what happens when we don't coordinate and vote together collectively. This is the lesson to learn right now.
Because if the left vote, we all know.
Yeah, left wins.
We've got a friend of the show in the chat. Let's put him up there. Harry Tam. Harry Tam says he accused me of taking 2 women across the northern border during COVID-19.
Oh, sir, I salute you.
Lockdown without consulting with me before he made the accusations on national TV. He was made to make a public apology to me after I threatened to take legal action. This is typical of his bullying behaviour, assuming that I didn't have the means to call him out. He was wrong, so wrong. Imagine how humbling it must have been to make a public apology to a gang member, Harry.
Absolutely. Harry is absolutely right about that. That was such an unbelievable thing for Winston to make that kind of allegation about without having any evidence. My God, that was just so outrageous. And I'm glad that he had to back down or face defamatory proceedings, because he was wrong.
And as you know, Harry, always welcome. We'll have you on again soon. I got a question for you, Marty, and this is a bit off track, but you've interviewed Winston several times. I've interviewed him several times. I used to live in Tauranga and saw him walking around with his cigarette and his whiskey. I interviewed Winston maybe 18 months ago was the last time I interviewed him on another podcast. What do you think of him today versus Winston in the past? And I'm kind of thinking about him as a person, him as an operator. Has he slowed down? Is this authentic, this King Cooker he's taken on board? Or is he just finding a base because he wants the power? What do you think of him today versus Winston of yesteryear?
Oh, look, I mean, I was a big Winston fan. I believe he was, at his height, he was the greatest he ever was during the wine box inquiry, when he took on all of corporate New Zealand almost single-handedly and fought those buggers. I have an enormous amount of respect for him from that. And I have an enormous amount of respect for what New Zealand first represented as a genuine economic nationalism and a bulwark against neoliberal free market capitalism. However, he has drifted so far from that. And my fears are that while he was out of office, the private personal consultants contracts and consultancy that he did as a side hustle between his time in Parliament, they're very unvetted. We're not sure who he was taking money from before he got back into Parliament. However, suddenly a lot of donors are suddenly having their greatest wishes fulfilled.
Yeah.
I think that his leaning into the QAnon conspiracy swamp is deeply, deeply, deeply problematic, because these people, many of them, live in an alternate reality. And for them, what they want from the Royal Inquiry is a Nuremberg-level trial where there will be public hangings of Jacinda and her family, right, along with their pets. And so he can't give them that. He can never give them that, right? And you can already see the friction points erupting online in Telegram and amongst the sovereign sheriff community, who are outraged that they aren't going to have this great big trial, and they're not going to look at the deaths, and they're not going to look at the blah, 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 all the nonsense stuff. Because, of course, nonsense stuff can't be done in public, right? It's because it's nonsense stuff. And so they're already turning, and the problem of seducing this group of people is nothing he ever does will be enough for them. And the danger is they'll turn on him in a radicalization. And this is the problem when you tempt and flirt with that kind of hate algorithm. And he's got to constantly do it now to be able to stay in power. And I mean, we are not signing up to the WHO legislation. Remember, all that is, oh my God, it hurts my brain. All that is if there's a new pandemic, we'll alert the UN, the WHO, right? It's just an agreement of, oh shit, if something happens, we'll let you know as soon as possible, right?
Yep.
But we're withholding that. We're withholding signing that because people in Northland think the WHO were working hand in hand with the Chinese to
and
create
Fauci.
the COVID, let it loose, and take over the world for one world shadowy cabal. Now, because those people believe that, they're holding up this legislation, and we were laughing stock for doing it. So his need to stay in power is creating real world problems, and for whatever good he does, whatever good he's supposedly doing, the damage and the harm that he is unleashing here is problematic for our democracy. I think he's becoming a problem.
I said this a few months ago. I'll say it again. My father passed away in June of last year, on the eve of my birthday. The selfish prick. There was this change in the way he thought, how he spoke, and how he acted. He was 83 in the last couple of years. And I'm obviously not diagnosing anything here, but I'm looking at things that I've seen in other people. I can see the kind of the way that my dad's brain was starting to work in Winston. I can see him slowing down. I can see him, he does that thing where he says something really mean. He goes, that kind of thing where he thinks he's being funny, but he has no idea. He's got to an age where it's not that he's not reading the room, it's that he can't read the room. And, my lovely dad said some pretty mean things in his last 6 to 12 months sort of thing. And it's more than just a political tactic. It's a cognitive change. And whether it's 1%, 3% or 10%, I don't know, but I see it in him like I saw it in my dad. And that concerns me.
Yeah, and I think that this goes. You're absolutely right. The meanness and the bordering on cruelty doesn't seem like valid. I mean, we're all adults, right? It doesn't need to take that tone for crying out loud, right? Then he goes there so quickly. There's that. There's also like the presentation of his speech, his diction during it. It was all a bit frenetic, And watching him doing his performance was concerning enough. And you're right, there is an element of like a Bidenism, like there's a stumbling of the thought process, and you're kind of, should I catch him? Should I not catch? Like you're not sure. You're concerned about him, and I think that if this starts progressing, then it starts coming across like old man-itis, and that's going to be a real vote killer.
Yeah, I mean he's 80 this year or 80 next year.
Oh look, he's and you type his details into any death calculator, and he should have died 14 years ago. He is a survivor in the most ultimate sense, but this angry Winston, I think it's winning votes amongst those who feel resentment, but for the middle, I just think it's ugly. It's ugly politics. We're better than this.
I think he's 79 this year, so 80 next year. And one of the ironies, of course, is a lot of his supporters, a lot of his voters are the ones who are saying Biden's too old, and he's basically the same age as Biden. So couple of super chats we want to get to from Spider Hoof. Hey Spides, haven't seen this. We'll certainly follow this up for tomorrow. National announced late today that they are cutting veteran services. Our government is disgusting. So I'm hearing it here first from you, Spider. I'll look at that for tomorrow night's show. In fact, Spider, you're coming on tomorrow night's show. Why don't you look at it? And you can do the work on that one, and we'll bring it up tomorrow night's show.
You should, if you are on social media, you need to be following Spiderhoof. That amazing. There are a couple of people out there, and this is more important than ever. This is why BHN is, I think, so bloody important as well. With so much of the news infrastructure just falling over right now, if we're not prepared to step up and actually do the journalism, then no one's going to. And that's really scary and way more dangerous. So everyone who's participating and working in this, understand how your active participation makes all of this possible for these guys.
Yeah, and I've said it before. I mean, looking at the numbers who are watching live right now, I mean, we're not to 1,000 live viewers, but we're up above 700, getting towards 800 for a show with only 7,000 subscribers on YouTube. We've got 10%. 10% of the audience watching. Like some of the American teams that have got 5 million subs, they don't get 500,000 people watching. They get a couple of thousand, So this community is reaching out for this stuff. And that's why people like Spiderhoof and you, Marty, and Jordan Rivers and Paul Barlow, Paul the other one, and all these people, and we want to link people into and do more together for that exact reason. Yeah. So that when News Hub falls over, there's other stuff for them to consume. Ingest. Yeah.
And this kind of messaging and this kind of work is going to be needed more than ever before. This government needs shitloads more scrutiny, not less. Oh, sweet Jesus, not less. Way more. Way more. Because if we're not watching what they're doing, they do shit like this, right? They take away from the veterans. Who would screw over who would screw over veterans? Who would screw over workers? Who would screw over renters? Who would screw over state tenants? Who would screw over beneficiaries? Who would screw over the disabled? Oh, this government. They just do it. They just do it. It's what they do.
Because what they don't do is make policy. They cancel stuff and they respond to Labour's policy.
Yeah. And the stuff they do for us is just awful.
Yeah. Peter, for a $2 super chat, the common clay of the Old West, morons. So come up from a comment we said. And I quite like this one. So thank you. And thank you for the $2 super chat. Also, PCE 12345 sounds like a real authentic channel, but it says you guys need a bearded lady on this channel.
Yeah, we do. Yeah. We'll bring it.
If you know a bearded lady, then send her our way. I'll just say this, and I've said this a few times. This is called Big Hairy News. The genesis of the names has nothing to do with facial hair. I know it's kind of ironic. When I started this, I was thinking about the big, hairy, audacious goal. And I thought, the big, hairy, audacious news story of the day. That's where it came from. It didn't come from facial hair, but there's a strange...
It's become that.
Become that. Hey, let's go to the last story of the night, because I think... God, I mean, it's funny. I leave these shows and I feel quite energized, but I also am aware that some of the stuff we talk about is real heavy and depressing. I mean, here's the latest story. This is the IMF, and they're talking about what's happening in New Zealand's economy. They use a phrase which is something like, we can't borrow any more for tax cuts, or we can't borrow any more to help service our tax cuts. And it just made me think, what is happening, as we said, behind closed doors? If we can see what's happening with Winston in front of the doors, what's happening behind closed doors, what's happening economically and financially behind closed doors. So this is the IMF, who are in New Zealand at the moment, apparently, an impossible mission force, is that what they are? And they're telling us about what we as a country should look out for. And strangely enough, the things we should look out for are a lot of the things that National are doing.
The International Monetary Fund's been in town checking out our economy. It thinks inflation will squeeze back under the desired 3% by the end of the year. But it's warning the government its tax cuts could add to inflation.
Well, not warning, they will. It's more money in the economy. It can't not. Now, it's good that inflation's coming down. We all applaud that, but it's not might. I'm sorry to correct the International Monetary Fund, but when there's more money in the economy to spend, it adds to inflation. That's what inflation is. More money going around for fewer products. That's what the driver of inflation is.
Any sort of outcome should be done in a fiscally neutral way. And as you can understand, this could mean many ways, potentially on the timing and also on the size of those proposed measures.
The IMF and many economists are welcome to make recommendations.
as it has
And
for
there
many
we have the constant refrain from the national government. We are going to ignore the expert advice if it doesn't fit our narrative. Oh, we acknowledge there are many views on this. Oh, yep. The IMF, you know, those financial experts, they say something and we hear what they say. Do you do anything about it? Nope. Of course not. We don't do any reports in breach of international orders. We just do what we want when we want. And we cite the experts when it suits us. For example, how many times have you heard Christopher Luxon say, the experts say this will put downward pressure on rent. The experts say this will force downward pressure on rents. Now, when it's an expert they like, they'll use it. When it's one they won't, which is far more than the one they do, they ignore it altogether, Marty.
Right.
We'll keep going with this story. It's got a bit more to go.
years. It also says we need more houses and more taxes. Another push for a capital gains tax.
More taxes.
Treasury and IRD also have very similar opinions. So I think there is quite a lot of good enough advice out there to influence the public debate.
It's clear that not everyone does think it's a good idea.
But the IMF comments today, another sign the pressure the Finance Minister is under as she preps her first budget.
So get that again, guys, what was just said. Treasury, IRD, IMF are all yes for capital gains tax, are all yes for more taxes. National, nope, nope, nope. And this is a bullshit thing that Labor did last time by cowardly pissing away from capital gains tax. It's a thing we should be doing, and it's a thing that's popular, and fuck knows why they were too much of a coward to actually put it out there.
I think what's happening in terms of beneath the surface stuff, last month the ratings agencies downgraded our council debt because the government had revoked the Three Waters legislation and created these new ventures, these new products, these new packages that didn't have any government guarantee to them. So bond markets had no interest buying them because it's not guaranteed, right? Yeah. So the ratings agency downgraded the council debt, and that caused an enormous jump in how much people are having to pay in their rates, and you're starting to see that come through in those rate rises now. When Liz Truss in the UK got into power and implemented radical neoliberal policies that didn't have, that was borrowing for tax cuts and didn't try to increase any of the revenue, which is what this government's trying to do, when they implemented those policies, the market itself turned against the UK government. And I think that what we're seeing with the IMF making these warnings, they're saying to the government, okay, we get that you're going to cut services, we get that you're going to put in tax cuts, but you're not raising revenue anywhere else. Yeah. This is becoming destabilizing. And what you could get is a run on the market, right? Where the market goes, this isn't believable. This is another, you're going too far. You're so right wing that these policy decisions don't make sense. The New Zealand dollar's in danger. Now, because we've got such problems with trading with China and the trade with China has really, really dropped off. With our economy in such a fragile position, if they go ahead with these tax cuts and push ahead with these things without getting extra revenue in, which is what the IMF is saying, there could absolutely be some unforeseen run against the economy that would hit people's Kiwi savers, and they would probably have their house prices drop dramatically as well. So this is not the time to be just bloody minded about the economy. I think that it requires a hell of a lot more subtlety, and I don't know if this government's capable of that.
And as Gordon says, it's not like a lefty, a kind of lefty right-wing group. The IMF is definitely not a lefty organisation. It's not a lefty thing. They're saying more tax. IMF is saying more tax.
That's what they're saying. That's exactly what they're saying. Yeah.
Yep. or else we can't pay for it. I'm going to play you the last little bit. Now, often we don't do the commentary at the end of these stories, Bomber, but I think there is a part in here that Katie Bradford reports, which is actually quite valuable to hear. So this is the last kind of 40 seconds of Katie's analysis.
So, Katie, a lot of talk about Nicola Willis's first budget. Will she be borrowing to fund those tax cuts?
Well, here's where it gets interesting. She insists no. Yes, the government, given the current financial situation and the state of the books, the government is going to have to borrow to fund its coalition promises to fund this year's budget. Nicola Willis, though, when it comes to those much anticipated, much talked about tax cuts, that the money for those is coming from the reprioritisations, those cuts we've seen about across public services. We've seen a little bit of those. There's more to come. Some of the cancellation of Labour projects, etc. That's what she says is funding the tax cuts. The pressure is clearly on her, though, over these numbers. The IMF said today the budget must remain tight. They mustn't borrow more than they need to. It says our current debt to GDP ratio of 20% is sustainable. It's pretty good on international levels, but it has gone up in recent years. All of that means Nicola Willis needs to make sure her numbers add up.
So the obvious ludicrous nature of the situation is they say they're not borrowing for tax cuts, but they're borrowing from elsewhere, but it's one pool of money. So that's like me saying I've got $1,000 in the bank, right? And I'm gonna pay for my trip to Fiji out of that $1,000, and I'm gonna borrow another $1,000 to do the panel beating on my car. Right? No, I'm borrowing money for the car, not for the trip. But it's the same pool of money. If you weren't doing the trip, you wouldn't have to borrow the money for the car. If you weren't giving the tax cuts, you wouldn't have to borrow the money for the promises. So it's merely a mouth. We always talk about a shell game, Marty. You know that shell game? This is what they do. It's a shell game. We're not borrowing for tax cuts. We're just borrowing to replace the money we're using for tax cuts to pay for other things.
And that works to a political audience that don't know better. But when you take this to market, those people are traders. They know that doesn't work. And this is the risk, right? That there's if we can get this past the voters, that's one thing. I don't know if they can get it past the traders.
Yeah. Hey, it's been fun tonight, Marty. Anything else you want to tell the punters about?
I just think that we are seeing such a crackdown now on so many vulnerable people in New Zealand, and wherever you look, the solution isn't draconian measures. The solution isn't using the stick. You know, if there are unruly neighbours and state tenants, that requires more support. If there are kids who are hurting, that requires more support. The disabled should be getting more support. Lord, I find it difficult enough to get around the world as an able-bodied male. I mean, having a disability, I salute those people. That takes real bloody courage, and demanding that they get work tested every 30 seconds is not the way we respect their mana. We should be looking after those members of the whānau and those members of the community. And we should be making sure that there are more food in schools. Not less. We need more food in the bloody schools. We need bigger schools. We need teachers who are paid properly. We need police officers who are paid properly. And we need public servants who get extra holiday time and extra mental health time. And we need to fund that stuff. We need to be thinking about degrowth capitalism. We need to be thinking about adaptive climate change. My Lord, those surface temperatures coming off the ocean at the moment are just it's so far off the charts, it's not funny. We've got so many challenges ahead of us, and yet we've got a deputy prime minister who's behaving like a child, you know? And I just believe that there's a better way of doing things in New Zealand, and we've got to strive for that, because this bullshit from this hard right, racist, climate denying, beneficiary bashing government, we're better than this. We're better than this.
It's been a blast having you, man. Been good fun.
Thanks, bro.
And I always think about when we do one of these, whether Chewy's here or not, it's been very good to reconnect after all those years. And I feel it coming up from a sector. Like, we don't have the right family foundations, $2 million to get started and that kind of stuff, but there's something happening in this group of particular creators and stuff, and it's exciting to be a part of it. And thanks for being a part of the show tonight.
No, always, guys, always. You're doing God's work.
All right, team. Thanks for joining us tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night at 9 p.m. for another edition of Big Hairy News. Spider Hoof is joining us tomorrow night. Will she have a screen up, or will we see who she is? We'll have to tune in tomorrow night to find out. Stay safe, everyone. Come back tomorrow night. Bring a friend. Hooroo.